Good afternoon, everybody. We'll give it a minute or two for people to sign on, and then we'll get going. All right, gonna give it one more minute because we're missing a big chunk of people, and then we'll get started. I do have a group activity I wanted to start with, but maybe we'll just wait and do that later in the class to see if more people show up. Okie dokie. I think it will be better to do the assignment before we cover our next section. Well, actually, you know what? I can finish PTSD and then I can go to the group assignment. Worst comes to worst, we'll just do it with the people who are here and go from there. But, you know, I always like to maximize the number of people who can participate. So I'm just opening the slides and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, I'm going to share screen. Okay, so we are going to finish talking about PTSD. Hopefully a couple more people will sign on at that point. And then we'll do the group activity and then we'll sort of dive back into things. So we've been talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, but there's also a disorder you can be diagnosed with that's shorter term, and that's called acute stress disorder. And these are trauma-related symptoms that last less than a month. Most don't go on to develop PTSD, but certainly a percentage do sort of have symptoms that last past that month. One reason may be that those experiencing trauma, but not PTSD, tend to receive high levels of social support immediately following the event, the trauma itself. Individuals who suffer PTSD often perceive the world as a dangerous place from which they must retreat, and they come to view themselves as helpless to deal with stressors. Edna Thoa developed a type of therapy to really address those misconceptions in women who have been raped or assaulted. The idea that the world is a dangerous place, and the idea that they're helpless to deal with any stressors that come up. And she developed it to work with women, but it's actually been generalized to work with people of all genders as well. So in her therapy, the following are included. The first is education about the common psychological reactions to assault to help victims realize that their responses are normal. So I did this type of therapy the year that I was at the VA when I was working with the survivors of military sexual trauma, and actually did some of it for some of my other clients that year as well. And this education piece is really important. It teaches them a lot about, if you try to just ignore it, it's going to pop back up. My favorite analogy is like, let's say you're just like, I'm just going to block this out. It's fine. It's analogous to getting a bill in the mail and being like, I can't pay this now. So you like open up your desk drawer and you stick it in there and then you close it. I just closed my desk drawer and then you're done, right? Then maybe like 2 weeks later, I open my desk drawer to get out a pen and I'm like, shoot, there's that bill, right? And it could freak me out. And that's what can happen with PTSD symptoms when things remind them of it. You train them in skills such as relaxation. You have them emotionally relive the trauma by writing it out in between sessions. They do this twice over the course of therapy. And then you have them read it during session. And this allows victims to diffuse their fears of the trauma. And lastly, the bulk of this therapy focuses on what's called cognitive restructuring to help that survivor replace negative beliefs about their competence and agency and adequacy and how the world operates with more realistic appraisals. Now, one thing that I always feel the need to point out with any sort of cognitive therapy is that we're not replacing these thoughts with like perfect, happy, shiny thoughts, if that makes sense. They're more realistic thoughts. So like, yes, the world is dangerous, but not everybody is out specifically to get you, right? And there are things you can do to feel more prepared when you go out into the world. There are people you can trust and they can help, things along those lines. People who go through this therapy have fewer PTSD symptoms. And in fact, this is so well empirically supported that when I was at the VA about 10 years ago now, they were just starting to roll out this therapy as like one of 2 therapies that every VA therapist was supposed to use for PTSD. The other one is called prolonged exposure. It works better usually for like combat related trauma, but also based on similar principles. So that's why I learned this therapy, that we had like a manual for it. We had worksheets for the clients. And again, I have personally seen it work really, really well. All right, so the next one we are going to talk about are the myths about PTSD and trauma and rape. And like I said, I'd really like you all to do the assignment before then. So we'll just go with the people who are here and y'all can rock the assignment. So I am first going to put the assignment link in the chat. Okay, so for this assignment, I'm going to give you a little bit more time. I'll give you like 25 minutes because There are several short articles you'll have to read to answer the questions. So rather than watching a video today, you will be sort of reading these news articles as your source material for what you're going to talk about in your groups. Lost Zoom for a second there. All right, so here is the assignment, and it has links in 3 of the questions, again, to those short articles that talk about the various cases. And I'm going to go ahead and get the breakout room set up while you all are getting everything together. All right, I am actually going to be able to do 5 groups, so hang on just a sec. I had assumed I wouldn't, and I only made 4 groups on the assignment, but it'll be pretty easy to just make a 5th. So give me just a second here. Alrighty. So now there is a page for group 5. And so I am going to create those breakout rooms. Each of them will have 3 to 4 people in them. Like I said, I'm going to give you 25 minutes so that you do have time to read those articles and also discuss. And if we're getting close to the end and you feel like you still need more time, you know, just use that question feature or pop back out and let me know, and I can always extend it. So, alrighty, I'm going to go ahead and open the rooms and then go ahead and click into them. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and reshare the PowerPoint. And the next part is going to be a little bit more interactive than some of our other portions. I should have just left this sharing because it's on the same thing. So go ahead and get this up. So we are going to start talking about these myths and stereotypes a little bit more often. So go ahead and just use the chat here as I ask some of these questions. So what are some of the myths you have heard about rape or rape victims? Or just things people say, and it might be unclear whether they're a myth or not. It's always a stranger who jumps out of the shadows. It's only women. Someone's in a relationship. It's all right no matter what. Not all men is a big one. Yeah. 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 And these are really interesting. Like for a long time, she deserved it. Ugh. For a long time, there was no such thing as marital rape. That wasn't officially labeled and made illegal till the 90s. And like date rape really only became somewhat in the awareness in like maybe the start of the 70s, but really in the 90s. It's what the woman wears and how she asked for it. Yeah, Greta said the same thing. She was asking for it. Why did you stay if he made you feel uncomfortable? Probably because you felt uncomfortable leaving, right? Yeah, so these are really good ones that we hear, unfortunately, quite a bit. And kind of related to that, another common one is that women always lie if they say they're being raped, that women say, they just say they've been raped when they regret having sex. So what do you all think the percentage is of people, we won't even just use women because again, people of any gender can be raped, people who falsely accuse someone of rape, people who say they were raped when they were not? What would you guess of the people who have been raped? What's the percentage? All right, so we've got 1 vote for less than 10%, 4%, 2%. Yeah, y'all are right in the range. Usually people are overestimating and saying like 50%, 80% until you're a very educated class. That's awesome. Yeah, it's only about 2 to 8% depending on what you look at. And that's identical to the statistics of people who lie about any other crime. So that often shocks people. It sounds like you all are not shocked, which is great. I'm glad that, you know, the education for that is good. But yeah, here's the idea. Some of these on the screen as well. Women can't be raped against their will. It wouldn't be rape if it wasn't against their will, right? Kind of going with this idea that all women have this rape fantasy, like, no. And then what we just talked about, that all accusations of rape are faked. Again, very, very small percentage that are. So, and again, comparable to any other crime, but because of all these reasons we've just been talking about, thinking about victim blaming and all of that, we tend to just assume. And in fact, until 2013, 2014, it's been since I've been at Wesleyan, the Norfolk Police Department actually had it in their laws that anyone who came in accusing someone of sexual assault should be assumed to be lying unless proven otherwise. Yeah, and I can see that looking at the all women lie narrative, from looking at relational aggression. If you're not familiar with what relational aggression is, just think of the movie Mean Girls. It's like the best example of relational aggression ever. So backstabbing, things like that. Yeah, so the idea that like they're just out to get guys if they're reporting it. In fact, most women who are sexually assaulted don't come forward at all. And if they tell someone, they may not actually report it to the police because they're afraid they won't believe them. And in fact, as we just saw with what I talked about with the Norfolk PD, in some cases that was codified not to believe them, right? So yeah, I think that there are a lot of misconceptions in the general public. And again, sounds like you all as a class are much better educated, so I appreciate that. So Field was a researcher in this area that concluded that there were seven different attitude clusters, for some reason that was a tongue twister, that contribute to our overall perspective of rape. Among his factors are the degree to which women are seen as responsible for preventing their own rape, as we've been talking about, right? We teach women how to not get raped rather than teaching men or other perpetrators not to rape, right? A desire for sex is seen as the main motive. That in and of itself is a myth. Rape is about power. It's about dominating someone. It's about controlling someone. And there may be sexual desire wrapped up in that, but it really is about power and control. Is severe punishment advocated for rapists? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. As we just saw, sometimes it's like, oh, boys will be boys. This is going to ruin those boys' lives, right? And then a woman is seen as instigating rape through flirtatious behavior or provocative dress. So what we talked about with the Canadian case, right? The idea that she was somehow asking for it. When again, like, maybe people just want to dress nice because they want to dress nice, right? So that's a big piece of this. All right, so the US has one of the highest rates of rape, and there are about 75 to 85 reported for every 100,000 people. And those are forcible rapes. So that doesn't even include rapes where it's not forcible, but coercion was used, for example. And according to the National Violence Against Women survey that was conducted in 2000, about 17.6% of all women said they'd been a victim of either rape or attempted rape. 21.6% of those women said they were younger than 12 years old at the time of their first assault. Almost a third reported being physically injured during their most recent rape. And almost 18 million women and 3 million men in the US have been raped. Again, I want to fully acknowledge that women are raped much more often than men. As are non-binary and trans individuals, unfortunately, they're actually much more likely to be victims of these types of attacks. But men also do get sexually assaulted, and we need to remember that. So women who report being raped as minors were twice as likely to report being raped as an adult. Again, some people twist that to, oh, well, she must somehow like seek it out. No, what it is the people who are perpetrators
look for weakness, right? Look for emotional things they can exploit. And they can identify someone who's somewhat broken. And they do. And they manipulate that and they take advantage of it. All ages, all social classes, all ethnic groups are vulnerable to rape. There's no one who's protected. Victims younger than the age of 12 account for 15% of those rapes. And then age 12 to 17 account for an additional 29%. So, I mean, we're looking at 45%-ish of sexual assault victims who are minors at the time. Other surveys report that between 1 and 12% of victims are over 50 years of age. So again, we think that like, oh, people aren't sexually assaulted if they're older. Yes, they can be. And unfortunately, one of the places it happens is in assisted care and nursing facilities where people who are supposed to protect them instead abuse them. According to the National Violence Against Women survey, only 19% of the men and 13% of, 19% of the women and 13% of the men who were raped after age 18 said their rape was presented to the police. So why are these rape reports so low? Why aren't people reporting? What do you all think? Go ahead and use the chat again. Fear, yep. Shame and embarrassment, yep. Yeah. I'm going to pause because if anyone's typing a sentence, it's going to take you a minute. Yeah, because people won't believe them. Scared of retaliation of the community. Yeah, Annika, that's a huge thing. So actually, after the Jane Doe case, her best friend, who was also my advisee, also left because of everyone who was slut-shaming Jane Doe. And she just couldn't take hearing it anymore. Now, interestingly, under Title IX on college campuses, retaliation is actually covered as like a separate offense. However, that doesn't mean it doesn't happen, right? Yeah. So, yeah, people might think, and women, a lot of these slides say women, but again, all people who are sexually assaulted are going to kind of go about this the same way. They might think reporting won't actually help. They might think that they'll suffer further embarrassment as a result of reporting, or that there just won't be believed, right, by the law enforcement officers. And as Annika just said, many victims are afraid the attacker will retaliate if charges are made, and these expectations are sometimes fulfilled. Another thing I should note is that if you do report, and if you report, like, I think it's within the first 48 hours after you're sexually assaulted, you are typically tasked with undergoing a rape kit, which is good because I can collect evidence from you, but it's very invasive. So it's essentially a gynecological exam, and they take all sorts of samples and swabs. They take your clothes from you. And so some women who are sexually assaulted talk about that experience being almost as bad as the rape itself, because it's so invasive. Yes, Casey, this is a really good point. Rape kits are expensive and they're not covered by insurance. Law enforcement doesn't always pay for them. So I think some insurances might cover them, but so like you're paying out of pocket to collect evidence. And like, again, nowhere is that the case anywhere else in the system. And part of the problem is, right, you have to go to usually a healthcare facility, often a hospital, to get a rape kit done. And so then the billing becomes more murky. But yeah, so there are rape survivors who have to pay for their evidence to be collected. And then, as we talked about before, some of those evidence kits have sat for years not being tested in warehouses and what have you. And then when they finally test them, they realize, oh, there are these serial rapists, so we could have prevented rapes, right? It's infuriating. Yeah. So here are some statistics about college campuses. Now, one thing I want to say is none of these are meant to frighten you all. It's just sort of the grim reality, right, of unfortunately what happens. So this was a study of college students who were both male and female. So about a fifth of the men reported unwanted sexual conduct. A little more than a fourth of the women reported unwanted sexual conduct. And this could be anything from, wow, Greta, I had no idea they were that expensive. $3,000 out of pocket for a rape kit. Oh my gosh. Woo. That's just like, I don't have that kind of money just sitting around. I'm guessing you also don't either. That's really, really terrifying.
Yeah, we were talking about it, and most insurances don't deem it like a necessity exam, so they won't cover it. And we heard that they could be up to $3,000. So I thought that was really interesting that they're that much, and insurances don't think it's deemed a necessity when really they are, because who wants to have to go through that kind of exam?
Right, right. Or like law enforcement should be paying for them just like they pay to dust for fingerprints, or other things like that. That's horrifying. Thank you for sharing that. I had no idea they were that expensive. I'm actually going to write that in my notes so the next time I teach this class, I can mention that. Okay. So women reported the more use of physical force against them, and alcohol was associated with coercion, being coerced. So 95% of the attacks went unreported from the sample. So 20 to 25% of women will be raped or experience attempted rape during their college career. 90% of those people know the person. Again, as Jackie said earlier, or somebody else might have said, we think it's like this person in the bushes, right? But most often, unfortunately, it's someone you know, right? And 42% of women who are raped in college tell no one. So, this 95% statistic is people who didn't tell the authorities, but 42% like don't even tell their closest friends or their family. And again, for those same reasons we talked about: shame, embarrassment, fear, fears of not being believed or of retaliation, particularly if this is a person within their social circle, right? 10 times more rapes are reported to crisis lines than are reported to the police, which kind of goes with that statistic, right? So who are people that rape? Experts have developed a typology. It doesn't mean that every person who rapes is exactly this, but it tends to emphasize 4 factors that distinguish different types of rapists. So the amount and type of aggression that was used, so essentially how violent it was, when the aggression was high, did that heighten sexual arousal in a sadistic manner. I just taught my abnormal class about sexual sadism, and that is a disorder. It is a paraphilia in the same sort of classification as pedophilia. So that might be what's going on in this case. Whether the offender showed evidence of psychopathy, which we talked about earlier in the semester. So is it someone like Dexter? Whether the offender relied on deviant sexual fantasies to produce sexual arousal. And you can have a rapist who doesn't really check any of these, who's just using coercion or I don't want to say just, right? Because that still is going to lead to a rape, right? So coercion or drugging someone's drink or things along those lines, right? So date rape is this term that, like I said, is a relatively new term in the grand scheme of things. So over 3/4 of rapes are committed by acquaintances, and these are the assaults that people are least likely to report. In one survey, 22% of college females reported being a victim at least once of an attempted or completed acquaintance rape or date rape specifically, so someone they knew. They tend to occur on the weekends between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m. Usually happen at your home. And they involve situations where both the attacker and the victim have been using alcohol or drugs. They're less likely to involve weapons. Really interesting, side note on that. So again, we have this stereotype that it's someone in the bushes with a gun or a knife, right? It's a really difficult read. But if anyone is sort of interested in this topic and wants to read a first-person perspective of it, Alice Sebold, who wrote The Lovely Bones, her memoir is called Lucky. And it is about being sexually assaulted in a typical stranger danger, like at knife point sexual assault, and how much difficulty she still had with people believing her. Like even her own father was like, what do you mean he dropped the knife at some point and you couldn't get away? So again, like really heartbreaking to read. But then again, imagine on top of that, there's no weapon, right? you know this person. Sometimes it is your significant other. One of my suite mates in college was sexually assaulted by her then boyfriend, right? And like, how do people deal with that? How do you even like cope with that? Date rapists tend to employ verbal threats and physical prowess, or again, some manner of putting them out of commission, whether it's giving them alcohol, drugging them, things along those lines. So victims of sexual assault suffer not only psychological, but also physical consequences. They suffer physical injuries, emotional pain and humiliation, and sometimes severe psychological after effects. Oh my gosh, I just realized class is done. Geez, sorry about that, y'all. I was really into talking about this. So we'll pick up here on Tuesday, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of this, and then we'll talk about battered spouses or domestic violence as well. And then, yeah, we'll kind of skim the other stuff we have left for the semester. I typically don't spend a ton of time on the types of prosecutions and whatnot. And then our last day, we'll talk about prisons, and we typically watch a video that day. Yeah, if anyone needs to stay after, feel free to ask questions. And if not, I will see you all in 2 days, and enjoy the weather. It looks like it's really nice out again, and it's just going to get yuckier throughout the week, I think.